I work at the laboratory's National Security Research Center, the NSRC. We get lots of questions from throughout the laboratory and, well, from all over the world as well. And so you can send your research questions, if you have them, to the to us at nsrc@lanl.gov, nsrc@lanl.gov. We get a lot of questions. We'd love to hear from you. You're paying for us, so you might as well. But anyway, that is the part of the laboratory that I work in. And yes, if you weren't aware, Los Alamos is still there. We're still here. We have about 18,000 people formally affiliated with the laboratory today. We've got more people than we've ever had before. So this talk really didn't start out as a historical lecture, if you will. It started out as kind of a security lecture. We have, as you might imagine, a pretty extensive security program at the laboratory. And so some of the senior leaders of it reached out to me and said, we'd like a historical perspective on the insider threat. Would you put a talk together for us? And so that was my original audience for this talk. And so all of you get to play, we'll do a little role play today. All of you get to pretend to be security investigators as we go through the talk. Your very difficult job is to catch the insider threat. Good luck. It's not easy. Now, the thing is, it's an espionage story, and everybody enjoys a good espionage story, but this one is real, and this one is going to have some real consequences as we get deeper into the talk, but we will start out a bit more lighthearted. Who's your favorite? Did I skip your favorite on there? Now the thing is, these are kind of some Hollywood spies, and they kind of stand out, don't they? I can promise you, if you show up in a tuxedo with a submachine gun, you're going to meet some security officials very quickly at our laboratory. The same, if we go into one of our vaults and you're dangling from the ceiling, you're going to be apprehended and questioned after that. They don't really blend in very well. Well, what you see now, these are what we refer to as badge photos from the Manhattan Project era at Los Alamos. Who do you think is the spy? So James, he's got his pick. I don't know if this has a laser. I'll probably turn it off, so I'm going to stick with the safe button. Almost every time somebody says it's Betty Lou Runyon. Did some of you think it was Betty Lou? Okay, well, don't throw anything, but the actual answer is no one. None of these people were spies, as far as I know. And that's the point. Unlike the Hollywood spies, an insider is much more difficult to pick out. And I will make the point that, we have had over the decades, 80 years, hundreds of thousands of people who have been affiliated with our laboratory. Virtually none of them are insider threats. But as we're going to see again today, just a few or even one can change the course of history. So it is a very serious threat. So be thinking about that. As I introduce you to the spies in just a moment, you might be looking for those common threads. Are there ways that you might be able to spot an insider threat early on? It's pretty difficult. Now, I don't have time to talk about the context today. Fortunately, Rich introduced us to the world context. And if you look at some of the posters, you get kind of a sense of what World War II was like. The world has not seen anything like that since, and I hope that we never ever do again. Do keep the World War context in mind, because it was a very different world than the one that we live in. But do have in the back of your mind that when the Manhattan Project formally came into existence in August of 1942, it seemed like there was a very real prospect of Nazi Germany developing nuclear weapons. And that remained the case into 1943 and throughout much of 1944 as that threat kind of seemed to erode. But do think of a world in which Adolf Hitler has nuclear weapons and no one else does. That is kind of the world that Los Alamos is born into. Over the course of approximately 28 months, two entirely different types of nuclear weapons were developed. And so at Los Alamos, the Manhattan Project, as Denise and Rich alluded to, was this huge national, really international effort when you consider that there were scientists from various countries who participated in it. Between 500,000 and 600,000 people participated in the Manhattan Project in one way or another. Los Alamos, in terms of personnel, was relatively small, but had the important mission of designing, building, testing, and helping deliver these weapons in combat. Okay, so that was the mission at Los Alamos. Of course, we all know Bob Oppenheimer up there, right? When you've known him as long as I have, he's Bob. It's Bob's actually made me a lot of money working for the laboratory and telling his story, so I'm very grateful to him, and maybe next time we'll talk a little bit more about Robert Oppenheimer. I should be more respectful of our first director. But anyway, this idea of a nuclear weapon was tested July 16th, 1945 at full scale. You see a photograph of the Trinity test. There are 21,000 tons of TNT, and you could put it on a plane and drop it wherever you wanted. And also, we talked about this a little bit yesterday, a few of us. These could be reproduced about once every 10 days after the bombing of Nagasaki. So these were weapons that would keep coming back. Jim Konetka, who's with us, has done some research, I believe, at the National Archives and shared records with me pertaining to that, and we have others as well. But of course, I mentioned this too. It's difficult for me to talk about any Manhattan Project topic without at least acknowledging the use of nuclear weapons at the end of the war. That's not the topic for today, combat use, but if you do have questions pertaining to that, you can ask me, and I will try to answer them as well as I can. But we all know how these weapons were used, and I do give a lecture on that for a different day. Of course, Rich Frank has a book on it, and hopefully you got a copy signed. You all paid good money to hear about spies, though, today, so let's jump right back in it. The way that this is going to work, I'm going to introduce you to each of the 4 known individuals who committed espionage at Los Alamos during World War II, tell you a little bit about their background. It will be pretty easy to pick out why they committed espionage. And just to be clear, all of them were spying for the Soviet Union. No one was spying for Nazi Germany or Japan or something like that. These are all spies for the Soviet Union. Then we'll talk about kind of why it matters and what the consequences of this espionage were, and then we'll wrap up by finding out what happened to these individuals. So very quickly, we start with Ted Hall, and I call him the boy genius for reasons that you've probably already read on the screen. He finished Harvard at 18. What were you doing when you were 18? I wasn't finishing Harvard, I can tell you that. But anyway, he's very bright. He has an undergraduate degree in physics. And of course, if you've got a degree in physics, we've got a job for you at Los Alamos. And so that is how that's how he arrives there. The thing is that I show him first because he's also the first to actually take information out of the laboratory. He is the first of the 4 spies to commit espionage at Los Alamos, at least. So anyway, he is what people who are real experts on this, and I'm going to introduce you to some scholars in this field as we go through the talk. Ted Hall is what we would call a walk-in, okay? So he was not recruited by the Soviet Union. He was not trained by the Soviet Union. He was sympathetic to the cause. You can get some hints up there. He's interested in the ideology, and he volunteers. And so, I told you that you would get to pretend to be American security people. Imagine that you are an NKVD intelligence handler. So the NKVD became the KGB. Some of you know that, the KGB, the Soviet secret police. What would you think if he shows up? Would you be suspicious? Would you think, okay, what's really going on here? Are the Americans up to something? You'd be suspicious. And they were very suspicious of Ted Hall when he showed up. But over time, they came to realize that he was the real deal, and this walk-in was just kind of a gift. And so his courier is going to be his friend, Seville Sachs. They're both given code names. Hall's code name is Malad. Now, the purpose of a code name is not necessarily to protect your identity. It's more assigned just as an efficiency. So he gets the code name Malad. What does Malad mean? Does anybody know? What does Malad roughly translate to? The youngster. So we've given the teenager the top secret code word or code name of the youngster. Again, that's not necessarily to protect your identity, but I don't know. If you want to come up with a code name, it might probably something that won't give away your identity, as it's going to do for Ted Hall a little bit later. Anyway, while he's at the laboratory, he arrives in early 1944. The laboratory wasn't even quite a year old at that point in time. He's in the physics division, later the gadget division, or G division, weapons physics. And in weapons physics, they are primarily looking at the imploding bomb. Now, he's a bright person, but he's also very young. He's not a senior member of the staff or anything like that, but he's got a pretty good view of a pretty sensitive part of the project. For instance, he's working on things like critical mass studies. So if you've heard the term critical mass, but you don't know what it is, all it basically means is the minimal amount of fissionable material that you need to achieve a nuclear explosion. Would that be a useful data point? That's just one of many that he would offer to the Soviet Union or another potential proliferator? Absolutely, because early on, if you go back to Einstein's letter that was written with Leo Szilard and sent to the president, they thought that you would need a boat to deliver one of these weapons. A big boat that would sail into a harbor. Well, what if you didn't need a boat? What if it was a lot smaller and could be put on a plane? It's a very, very important data point at that point in time. And so, again, he was involved in several aspects of the design of the implosion bomb. You can see his form behind his badge photo over there, his personnel questionnaire form that ends with his handwritten notes about what he contributed, the different studies, the different measurements that he made during the laboratory's early days. But anyway, that's how he gets into the program. And again, he's sympathetic to the ideology. Let's continue on and talk about Klaus Fuchs. Fuchs is an interesting character, and many of you have probably heard of him. I imagine that he's probably the most famous of the spies who were at Los Alamos during World War II. So as you're looking for those common threads, well, there's actually a lot of differences between Klaus Fuchs and Ted Hall so far. You'll see that he's a generation older. He was born in a different country. He was born in Nazi Germany in the early days. Now, you'll see up there that after Hitler becomes chancellor, that Fuchs leaves, and he goes to France first and ultimately to the UK. Why would he leave? Well, you can imagine. There's a lot of reasons. Well, if you look at Nazism, there's a long list of people that they don't like, right? So he is pretty close to the top of the list because he is a communist. Okay, I've heard people say that he was Jewish. He was not Jewish. Actually, I believe his father was a Lutheran theologian. If I've got that correct, but he was a communist. Nazis don't like communists, and so he apparently was beaten up pretty badly and left for dead by Nazis at one point. So he leaves. Ultimately, ends up in the UK. And the reason that I call him the brilliant ingrate. So let me ask you this: your country wants to put you in some sort of detention center, concentration camp, where they're going to beat you up repeatedly, maybe ultimately kill you. Another country welcomes you in. Would you be grateful for that country? I would be grateful for that country. Not only that, but as you can see, he's also able to finish his PhD in the UK at the University of Bristol. I'd be grateful for that too. One thing you might not be grateful for is that he was a German citizen in the UK when the war started. What happens to German citizens in the UK when the war starts? You're an enemy alien and you go to a detention center. I think that he spent some time in Canada and on the Isle of Man, but that was pretty common practice in most countries during World War II. Of course, we've got our own experience with that starts to get pretty controversial. That's a story for a different day here in the United States as well. But anyway, he is released. I guess they became convinced that, yeah, he seems to hate Nazis. They let him out, and he is recruited by his essentially mentor, almost a father figure, Rudolf Peierls. Peierls was a German physicist who had left. Of course, he was Jewish, went to the UK. Peierls recruits Fuchs into the British program. And the United Kingdom also gives him British citizenship. So they have given him safe haven, finishing his education, a PhD. They have given him a job, and they've given him a citizen, made him a citizen, a subject. Would you be grateful? Of course you would be. How would you repay that favor? He repays it by giving information to the Soviet Union. Okay, and so remember, during World War II, the Allies, well, the Soviet Union was one of the Allies, but there are many reasons not to trust the Soviet Union. There's a Soviet perspective on this too, but they're not paying me. So you can ask me, you can ask me during Q&A if you want, and I'll give you a little bit of my insight into that. But anyway, you get the American perspective today. And so with Fuchs, that's how he gets in. He gets into the British program, immediately starts sharing information. The British were way ahead of the Americans at this point in the war, okay? And they helped us. You know, we think about the Einstein letter. That happened like 3 years before the Manhattan Project came into existence. The British played a tremendously important part of this, saying, no, you can actually make one of these probably pretty quickly and drop it out of a plane. You want to join us in the war now before Hitler gets one? That was the basic idea. Well, we thank the British, work accelerates, we catch up and surpass the British, and then thank them by saying, yeah, we're not going to share information with you anymore. Because if we do, you could use it to make money after the war's over that we would want to make. That's really the reason why. Churchill personally intervenes. The Quebec Agreement is signed the next summer. I believe that this is now summer of 1944, and it makes the UK effectively the junior partner of the United States in the Manhattan Project. So the British send some of their best scientists to the Manhattan Project, to the U.S., including about 24 scientists who came to Los Alamos. Guess who one of them is? One is Klaus Fuchs. And Fuchs was, I don't throw around the word brilliant. I think by definition, this was a brilliant person. He was exceptionally bright. He had that PhD. He had experience in the British program. He was a very, very good physicist. He is going to be based at the laboratory in the theoretical division. So the theoretical division was very much into bomb design, and he is looking at very sensitive aspects of designing an imploding weapon. In an imploding weapon, you'd use high explosives to compress a core of plutonium. Okay, that is basically how it works. Explosives are supposed to expand releasing energy, but we're going to take off-the-shelf explosives and try and make them do the opposite thing that they were invented for. Who in the world is an expert on that? Well, not really anybody, so let's get Fuchs and Peierls, who was his boss during World War II, at Los Alamos as well, and have them look at it. So the thing is, because he is more senior, he's got more access to more places in the laboratory. Denise told you about the compartmentalization that went on at Oak Ridge. That happened at Los Alamos as well. So the higher up you are, the more need to know you have. And so he is also a section leader. He's a manager, essentially, about the lowest range of manager, but he is a manager at the laboratory, so he has a lot of access. And remember, he's not just stealing information. A lot of this information he is coming up with himself, and it's very important to the success of the project. He is another walk-in of sorts. Of course, you know what his ideology is. He's a member of the party. He wants to help out the Soviet Union, and he does. His code name is Charles, which is kind of like Klaus, if you're in England, I guess. But anyway, that's how he gets into the project, and you can see his form in the background right there. As we race through, I believe David Greenglass was mentioned earlier because he had been at Oak Ridge before he came to Los Alamos. So you'll notice that Greenglass is about the same age as Ted Hall. They're about the same age, and they're from the same place. I'm sure it's just purely coincidence that you've got a couple of New Yorkers that are spies. But it is an interesting coincidence. Now, you'll notice that David Greenglass and his wife, Ruth, joined the Young Communist League in 1943, because why not? We're allies, right? Now, when you look at communism, communism was almost mainstream during the Great Depression because it looked like a pretty good idea. If you didn't know where your child's next meal was coming from, would you consider doing things differently? And a lot of people in this country, those things were uncertain for them, just the basic necessities of life. The message coming out of the Soviet Union was, hey, everybody here is free and equal and has a job and a place to live and something to eat. Sounds like a pretty good idea. And so it was popular in the United States during the Great Depression when Stalin helped Hitler invade Poland. Well, that kind of was a setback for a lot of communists in this country. But once the Soviet Union was stabbed in the back by the Nazis and they became an ally, it was okay to be fairly open about this. So you might ask the question, well, how on earth did a member of the Young Communist League get into work at Los Alamos? Well, one thing, you've got basically a kid at this point in time. Do you think he's going to get a deep background check before he's drafted by the Army? No, they're not going to do that. Now, Oppenheimer, that's a whole other story, isn't it? But they're not going to look into his background. They're going to say, you got any skills? He's going to say, well, I'm a machinist. Really? We've got a job for you. And that's when he was sent to Oak Ridge. Because remember, it's one thing to theoretically conceive the idea for a nuclear weapon. It's another thing to bring in engineers to actually come up with a design that you can translate into physical reality. But who's actually going to make stuff? People like machinists, and that's what David Greenglass did. And so once he arrived in Los Alamos, What he did, among other things, was he made the molds that were used to cast high explosive shapes for the implosion bomb. So all the high explosive that was in the imploding type weapon, all those blocks were shaped in a certain way to try and maximize the amount of force on the plutonium at the middle of the bomb. Well, how do you shape high explosive? Well, the first thing is you're going to go get a candy kettle, okay? Like you'd mix chocolate in, you will melt the high explosives and stir it in the candy kettle, and then you will pour it into a mold shaped like whatever you want it to be shaped like. That was his job. Okay, so he's very young. He doesn't have a PhD in this broad perspective of somebody like Fuchs, and he's not doing work that maybe is as delicate, the type sensitive, if you will, as the work that was going on by Ted Hall. But I do want to change this penultimate bullet here. The idea is not really to look at these different spies and rank them. Who was the most devastating? Who was the most useful? And things like that. The better way to think about this is, what did they collectively contribute to the Soviet Union? And so far, we have three people that are in different parts of the laboratory looking at different parts of the development of the atomic bomb. That's the way to look at it. So his view might not be as broad, but it was complementary and important as well. So anyway, we are going to talk a little bit later about his sister. Has anybody heard of his sister before? His sister, of course, was... right, so you're all right. We'll get to that later so I won't mention it quite yet. We'll get to the trial of the century in just a few more minutes, before OJ, anyway. So anyway, I should mention that his sister, Ethel Rosenberg, I guess I'll go ahead and put it out. I am sometimes asked, well, was she guilty of espionage? The answer to that is yes. She was definitely guilty of espionage. The real question is, we'll talk about the crime later. Does the crime fit, or does the punishment fit the crime? That's a much different question, and it's a very subjective question. But we will talk about her role a little bit more if we have time. But I can tell you now, part of the espionage was she helped recruit her brother to commit espionage, which is espionage. Let's talk about spy number 3, and that is Oscar Seborer. Now, Oscar Seborer was not discovered until September of 2019, or at least that's when the article on Seborer was published. And I'll tell you about the two people that discovered his story in just a few minutes. So he was born in... I told the security people, we could get rid of 75% of all espionage, all the insider threat, just by getting rid of the New Yorkers. But that's the punchline in the talk, right? But anyway, yeah. So he's the same age, and he's from the same place as two of the others. It's purely coincidental. We'd also have to get rid of people like Oppenheimer and Feynman if we got rid of New Yorkers and Denise. We don't want to do that, so we're not gonna approach security in that manner. He done some work at the Ohio State University. He studied electrical engineering there. So when he gets drafted into the Army, and they find out that he knows a little bit about electrical engineering, just like David Greenglass, he's going to be sent to the Special Engineering Detachment. He's going to join the Manhattan Project. He's going to go to Oak Ridge first and then to Los Alamos. So the thing is, when we're talking about nuclear weapons are very complex things. That's no surprise, with a lot of different components. It's not just a single idea. There's a lot of parts, and a lot of parts had to be invented for nuclear weapons. One of those parts that had to be devised at Los Alamos was the detonator. How do you set off all of those high explosives? Well, you've got to have very reliable detonators that you embed into the explosives. How do you set those off? Well, you have to have a firing circuit. These are very difficult challenges for Los Alamos in late 1944. So we have a young soldier at Oak Ridge who's taken some classes in electrical engineering. Let's send him to Los Alamos. They send him to Los Alamos, and just as he arrives, they're starting to get this detonating circuit and the detonators to work together more effectively. So he's not really needed for that. And so he is loaned out to the research division. The research division at that point in time, early 1945, was helping with the diagnostics for the Trinity test. Trinity was a heavily diagnosed test. There were a lot of experiments that went along with that, and that was part of the role that he played. So already he's been to Oak Ridge. He knows probably something about detonators, detonating circuits. Now he's doing diagnostics. This young, pretty low-ranking soldier is already getting quite a perspective of the project, there was a rehearsal test for Trinity called the 100-ton test. They took approximately 100 tons of TNT, I think technically it was 108 tons of explosives. They set it off because they wanted to know what would happen. Are our instruments calibrated properly? How much fallout are we actually going to produce? These are the main questions they were trying to answer. By the way, if you're curious, the answers to those questions were their diagnostics were actually off from a timing perspective. And so they were corrected as a result, and it ended up producing a lot more fallout. They predicted at this point a lot more fallout than they previously had based on that experiment. So he's been there as well. We also know that he wanted to be part of the destination group. The destination group is the team that was sent to Tinian, and he's on early rosters for the destination group, but he's dropped in later rosters. So we don't think that he went to Tinian, but he probably would have already been gaining some familiarity with bomb parts and different things like that. After the war was over, he transfers to Z Division. Z Division ultimately became what is today Sandia National Laboratories. There, he almost certainly would have become familiar with bomb parts, assembly methods, maybe disassembly methods. So take all of these things that he has seen, he's got a pretty useful perspective on all of this work as well. Now, he is given the code name Godsend, okay, for the Soviets. And again, he was not discovered until 2019, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the epilogue in just a moment. My colleague Ellen McGee, who some of us in the room know, Ellen did a lot of research on Oscar Seborer. We have an article that's coming out some century in the future on this one of these days. But anyway, we came across, Ellen did most of the work here, coming across these old memos. It's interesting that Seborer, as a private first class, is mentioned in a memo from the test director, Ken Bainbridge, to one of the group leaders. At that point in time, group leader was very high up in the laboratory's organizational structure and has good things to say. They're fighting over him. So that is a little bit about his background. He gets the rapid promotions. Now, we don't have, I'm going to leave it there for now. Has anybody heard of Perseus before? Okay. Has anybody wondered, well, is there a Perseus? And we now have the answer. The answer is no. And I'll explain Perseus in just a moment. Before I do, you can see, if you want to go ahead and read the quote on the screen at the bottom of the slide, you can. Historians Harvey Clare and John Earl Haynes. I don't know if any of you know of John and Harvey. They're the ones who discovered Oscar Seborer. They are exceptionally talented historians. There's a lot that's been written on espionage during World War II. If you want to get to the real scholarship, use of archives and interviews and things like that, properly assessing them, because there are a lot of sources in this type of history that are very difficult to work with, I would recommend anything written by either of them or the two of them together. Okay, and they concluded, if you can't read that, I'll read that for you. So Perseus was this, at the time, they thought it was another spy that had not been identified, tied to an individual. And so they say, but with the opening of the Venona decryptions in 1995, hopefully you know what Venona is, but if you don't, I'll tell you a little bit more about that momentarily. It became clear that Perseus was a Soviet-Russian intelligence disinformation operation to protect Theodore Hall, the real Malad. He had not been discovered in the early 1990s. Up to that point, nobody knew who Ted Hall was, at least in the world of espionage. And so anyway, the Soviets are trying to protect him. And so they create the Perseus myth and assign traits to Perseus that don't match up at all with traits possessed by Ted Hall. So Perseus did not exist. As they conclude, there was no Perseus. Let's talk for a few minutes about the legacy of the atomic spies. Now, the Soviets conduct their first full-scale nuclear weapons test August 29th, 1949. I think that's a stunning achievement. And the Soviets had very good scientists, okay? But what they also had during World War II was between 15 and 20,000 of their people killed every day on average as a result of military action. You heard some from Denise about our experience as a nation during World War II. We probably lost about 310 Americans killed in combat every day. 15 to 20,000, as many as 27 million people. Much of the European portion of the Soviet Union lay in ruin. Yet, only 4 years after the United States, they were able to develop a nuclear weapon. Espionage helped with that. The espionage was an important but not exclusive ingredient in this early success for the Soviet Union. You can see Yuli Karaton, who was one of the early Soviet scientists, on a postage stamp there. The whole Soviet people should be deeply grateful to Klaus Fuchs for the vast amount of information he provided Soviet physicists. Remember, he didn't mention Hall or Seborer there, for instance, because they had not been discovered at the point in time when he made that statement. And I imagine that after Hall had been, or I should say Greenglass had been put on trial and all of that, Greenglass is kind of an interesting character. Not to get off on a tangent, but I don't think that you would want to give a guy like that too much credit. Look up his interviews, and you'll understand why. You'll notice I didn't use the word brilliant to describe David Greenglass. Anyway, as we continue on, why does it matter? Now, Joseph Stalin is quantifiably one of history's great mass murderers. I think that current estimations place the number of people that were killed in the Soviet Union by the Soviet government during his reign, if you will, between 3 and 20 million people. That's totally aside from World War II fatalities, which I talked about before. I don't think it's a good idea to give somebody like that nuclear technology. Can we agree on that? So that's one thing. The other thing is, does anybody here have any connection to the Korean War? Do you have a parent, a grandparent, a brother, a sister? So there's several in this room. Do you know that conflict might have been totally avoided? Have you heard that before? I want to go and read something to you from John and Harvey's book, Spies, which is published by Yale. I don't know if we have any copies here, but I do recommend that book. Now, the North Koreans wanted to invade the South, but they could not get the backing of Moscow, and they were not going to invade the South without the backing of Moscow. So let me read you this passage because I want to make sure that John and Harvey get credit. Without massive Soviet military support, weaponry, munitions, vehicle supplies, and military technicians, North Korea was incapable of attacking the South. But in August 1949, the USSR exploded its first atomic bomb, and in early 1950, Stalin informed Kim that he was now willing to support an invasion. He cited several reasons for his shift in position. One of those would be the end of the Chinese Civil War, for instance. And one was a lessened risk of American intervention due to Soviet acquisition of the atomic bomb. Now, this espionage probably saved the Soviet Union anywhere from 18 months to maybe 3 years. Part of that range just about places this beyond Stalin's lifetime. Stalin died in 1953. Now, this is one of those historical what-ifs. We'll never know what actually would have happened, but it's plausible that the Korean War wouldn't have happened at all, or would have been delayed, or would have taken on some form. But again, it might not have happened at all. 30,000 Americans killed in that conflict, and probably millions of people killed when you also include North Korean and Chinese combatants. A major 20th century conflict was made possible in large part due to the espionage that unfortunately took place at Los Alamos during the war. As we continue on, we're almost, to the epilogue. And there's a lot of epilogue here, so we'll see how much we can get through it. But again, as you think of the challenges that security officials face today, we have secrets that are out there, as you saw during this lecture, can change the course of history. We want to keep them safe. We want to keep them out of the hands of people like Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, and unfortunately, they just seem to kind of grow back, don't they, in various different forms. It's a tough job. It's also a tough job considering that in the United States, we have individual rights here that need to be respected. If you suspect somebody of espionage, you can't just send them to the gulag, which you could do in other countries. So we have to balance these things, and that can be very challenging. It is interesting that you do have 3 young New Yorkers, 2 of whom were in the same division during World War II. I think there's a very good chance that Hall and Greenglass knew each other. Or I should say, let me take that back. That's possible too, but Seborer and Greenglass in particular, because they had so many similarities. There's no evidence that we're aware of that these individuals knew of each other's espionage, though, during the Manhattan Project. We believe that each believed at the time they were operating in their own vacuum. But really, to me, the interesting common thread here is that they were all given clearances. Yet they didn't have to be like Tom Cruise and pop out of the ceiling. We're configured to stop that threat. We're configured to stop people in tuxedos with submachine guns. We can do that. But the scary thing is, for just those almost statistically non-existent insiders, again, it can change history, and in this case, certainly not for the good. Let's talk very quickly about what happened to each of these individuals. I feel like I've left so much out of the story. I hope that this has been coherent. Has it been coherent? Mostly? Okay, very good. So anyway, let's start with Ted Hall. So wouldn't it be nice to be as smart as Ted Hall is? He finishes his work in physics and then decides, I think I'll be a biologist today. And he does. He goes, he gets a degree in biology and becomes a pretty esteemed biologist. That is how he is known to the world. He gets married. He has 3 daughters. Now, here's the thing. What is Venona? We mentioned the word Venona when we were talking about Perseus. Venona was one of the great secrets of the Cold War, maybe the greatest secret of them all. It was the program that successfully broke Soviet codes. And it's not just the existence of the program that's important, but it's also the how does it work? Now, our nation was able to crack those codes, and because they could crack some of those codes, they figured out that Ted Hall was Malad, guilty of espionage. They knew it 1949, 1950. Now, the thing is, he's guilty. We'll take him to court and we'll put him in the electric chair. It's just that easy, right? Wrong. Because in the United States, when you go to court, the way it's supposed to work is that your guilt is proven, is demonstrated in court. So what do we have to share with everyone if we put this guy in court? It's like, we know he's guilty because we can break Soviet codes. Well, if you're his attorney, what's the first thing you're going to say? Oh, yeah? How? So you're going to have to give away these 2 secrets. Now, he is no longer an open threat. They bring him and his handler, Seville Sachs, who was codenamed Star, in for interrogation. The idea is we don't want to prove guilt. We want them to admit guilt. So we'll get that bright light that's shining on me right now and shove it in their face and ask them nasty questions, and we'll try to get them to rat on each other. And that'll be that. Neither of them cracked in interrogation. So again, you're the FBI, you've got a decision to make. But anyway, they decide to let him walk because it's not worth it. He is not an open breach. We are not giving away Venona just to put this guy behind bars or in the electric chair. And nobody knows about it until 1996. Remember John Earl Haynes, who I introduced you to earlier? He was a historian at the Library of Congress. Guess where the Venona records ended up? He was one of the main people who brought Venona out into the public through official channels. And when it became public, it was pretty easy for the public to identify him as well. Now you can see, you might not be able to read it, so I'll try and read it for you if I can. When he was interviewed, I believe that he was interviewed maybe by some New York Times reporters as well. There's a book called Bombshell that's pretty good that you might check out. He said, I was indeed mistaken about some things, in particular my view of the nature of the Soviet state. The world has moved on a lot since then, and certainly so have I. Now, I think he would have been doing just fine to stop right there. But he didn't. He went on to say, but in essence, from my perspective of 71 years, I still think that brash youth had the right end of the stick. I am no longer that person, but I am certainly, but I am by no means ashamed of him. So those of you who had connections to the Korean War, what do you think? I don't know. I think he should feel some shame for what he did. He claimed that he feared the United States having a monopoly on nuclear weapons, and the U.S. did for 4 years. How do you think the world would look if Joseph Stalin or Adolf Hitler had a nuclear monopoly? Probably a little bit different, right? But anyway, he decided to bypass all of you, the voting public and Congress and everybody else, and take matters into his own hands. He died of cancer November 1st, 1999. So Klaus Fuchs. So Fuchs is a British citizen. He returns to the UK after the war is over. Venona is useful for identifying him. He's interrogated in the United Kingdom, and he cracks. He gives them the 2 things that they were after, a full confession and the name of one of his buddies. I don't have to go to the electric chair, right? No, we're only going to give you 14 years in prison. Great. Well, that turns out to be the maximum penalty in the UK for sharing information with a friendly country. They had never been at war with the Soviet Union, so he gets essentially no special treatment for this. Of course, the Soviet Union says, Klaus, who? We never heard of him. How can you accuse us of espionage? They disavow any knowledge of him. Well, anyway, he gets the final third of his sentence shaved off for good behavior, and he is released. He goes to East Germany. Now, the person I skipped over this, but the person who he mentioned, that buddy that he was working with, is Harry Gold. Harry Gold is the courier. So Klaus Fuchs would take information to Santa Fe, give it to Harry Gold, and then Harry Gold, off he would go. So anyway, Fuchs has avoided the electric chair. He's gone to East Germany. His former communist sweetheart from the early days has survived the war. They get married, and he lives until January 1988, within a couple of years of the Berlin Wall coming down. I'm not going to read these quotes since we don't have time, but have you looked at some of these? That's why I call him Dr. Oblivious. Look at the top one. And if you're wondering about the source for that quote, let me read the quote. It was always my intention when I had helped the Soviets take over everything to get up and tell them what is wrong with their system. Joe, you're not doing socialism right. Okay, he was that guy. The source for that is Rudolf Peierls, one of the most esteemed group leaders at Los Alamos during World War II, and almost a father figure to him. That's what Klaus said when Rudy went to jail to try and get him out, because how on earth could Klaus Fuchs be guilty of espionage? So that is what happened with Klaus. These quotes are unbelievable. So we get to David Greenglass. Guess what? Harry Gold is not fond of electrocuted chairs. And so he's going to play our game. When he is interrogated, he says, okay, look, I'm guilty. I'm the courier. You got Fuchs already. I was also carrying information for David Greenglass. Go talk to him. Can I live now? And so he gets a commuted sentence as a result. And so anyway, he's got to play the game. David Greenglass now has played the game. He says, okay, well, I'm guilty. You should go talk to my brother-in-law, Julius. Do I get to live now? Oh, and by the way, even though my wife, Ruth, knew about this, was involved in it, don't do anything to her. That's part of the deal. Nothing happens to Ruth Greenglass. And later he says, you should also talk with my sister. What a guy, huh? And so anyway, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were both guilty of espionage. They collected a lot of information. Unlike David Greenglass and all the others, they were not willing to play the game. They did not confess anything. They even told their two young boys that they were innocent. I think that was a pretty hard moment for their boys, as well, not moment, but over time as they came to realize that their father in particular was guilty and had lied to them. There's a lot of history on that you can find online as well, since I don't have any time left, I don't believe. But anyway, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg did go to the electric chair. They were executed in 1953. Both were definitely guilty of espionage, but as I mentioned before, that real question is, does the punishment fit the crime? That's for you to decide. All of us have different sets of values, different outlooks on this. But if you're wondering about guilt, they had both participated in stealing secret information and giving it to the Soviet Union during the war. David Greenglass lived until 2014. He died within a couple of months of the first iteration of this talk coming into existence. And look at this quote. As a spy who turned his family in, I don't care. Maybe this is why Keraton didn't mention him too, you know. I sleep very well. I would not sacrifice my wife and my children for my sister. You know, I seldom use the word sister anymore. I've just wiped it out of my mind. I imagine there's some kind of clinical description for whatever it is that he was suffering from mentally, but that is the bizarre story very quickly of David Greenglass. You see the picture up there? That's John Haynes there on the right and Harvey Clare in the middle, receiving an award from the CIA for the important work that they did in unmasking Oscar Seborer. That story is covered in great depth in their article, which is available online. And I can direct you there, but I think that if you look for it, I think it's pretty easy to come up. The FBI caught on to Oscar Seborer through an informant. They collected a lot of information on him through things like wiretaps, much of which would probably be illegal if it were going to court, but we're in history now, not the court. And so it is pretty damning when you look at it. Seborer, you have to imagine you would be nervous if you were Oscar Seborer watching the Rosenberg trial and all of these other being introduced to Klaus Fuchs, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I shouldn't use the word flee. I don't think that fled, at least, is the correct word here. But he and his brother Stuart, their spouses, they gradually planned to go on a very long vacation. First to, I believe, to the UK for about a month, and then to visit the Seborer parents who had immigrated to the new country of Israel at that point in time. Then they immigrated permanently. This is Oscar and his brother Stuart and their families to the Soviet Union, never to come back. By the time the FBI caught on to this story in 1954, he was gone. And so the real question was, well, what did he know? And so the FBI contacts Los Alamos, contacts the Atomic Energy Commission, which contacts Los Alamos, and they ask, well, what did he know? Was he even there? Is this real? And I would like to point out that our friend Ellen McGee found a lot more than Los Alamos gave to the AEC even back then, and we'll be putting that story together for you very soon. But anyway, Norris Bradbury knew about this. Our second director, many of us in the room know who Norris was. He knew about Oscar Seborer for decades, but the world didn't until John and Harvey's research in 2019 was published. Seborer died April 23rd, 2015, in Moscow, in anonymity. But anyway, I hope that was an interesting story. And again, everybody does like that good spy story, but this one had very serious consequences. We take, at the laboratory today, our security responsibilities, they are first and foremost. Safety and security, it matters. And remembering stories like this, I think, helps the workforce to understand why these responsibilities are so significant. Thank you for my extra 2 minutes and for your time.
Thank you so much. We will be doing a roundtable later, so if you don't get your question answered now, you can ask them then. So we have about 10 minutes for questions. All right, we got one right here. I'll get you.
So I saw on one of your slides, you didn't talk about Morris and Lona Cohen. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about them, and also just to point out that Lona was not from New York; she's from my neighborhood in Western Massachusetts.
So right, James. Thank you very much for that. I'm actually going to defer to John and Harvey on that because they are the Cohens. They have done a lot more work on the Cohens, and I don't know as much about them as I do about the individuals that I've introduced you to today. But I am pretty easy. I should mention as well, if we don't get to your question or you think of something later, or if you're not satisfied with my answer like this, I'm easy to track down. Send me an email. I get a lot of emails. I don't get to respond immediately, but I will respond. And I know these folks that we've talked about, well, not the spies, but I know John and Harvey and others very well and work with them. And we can probably get you to maybe some primary source documentation that's rarely been seen that will hash out these stories. At Los Alamos, I don't have as much access. I've tried to stick with the stories that I have the primary source documentation for. And so I do know a little bit more about that. But thank you for the question, though.
All right, we have a question over here.
What level of security did they possess?
Okay, so right. So the way that it worked during World War II is if you worked at Los Alamos, again, I'll speak about Los Alamos specifically because that's what I'm most familiar with. You had multiple layers of physical and information security, okay? And so in the case of each of them, they were given a security clearance, okay? But getting a security clearance doesn't open any doors. It has to be coupled with need to know. And so the way that need to know was demonstrated at the laboratory. You were given a pass, okay, that was signed by either Robert Oppenheimer or the head of security at Los Alamos. You had to present that pass to get to the place that you went to work. Okay. The other thing that you had to have in addition to the pass was a button. Have you seen? I don't think we. Well, maybe I do have it actually here. Let me go back several slides. There it is. Notice what he's wearing on his lapel. Have you ever noticed that in pictures of Oppenheimer from World War II? That is a button, and it has a unique identifier for him on it. Based on the color and the shape of the button that you were wearing, coupled with that handwritten note from Oppenheimer or the head of post security, that's how you got into different areas. And that's how it worked. And so, for instance, if you were a technician, you would have a button that was a shape and color that would not get you into a physics lecture. It would just get you to certain places. Now, as Greenglass, I think in particular, has pointed out, well, just because we weren't allowed somewhere didn't mean that we didn't go anyway. They would find ways to go in. I think that he talked about rifling filing cabinets of his superiors and other people when they weren't watching. It's not that security was lax at the laboratory, but it just, I don't think there was enough security probably inside to protect against things like that. And he took advantage of those gaps in the security program at the time.
It was compartmentalized.
Yes, it was compartmentalized. So for instance, Klaus Fuchs could go about anywhere that he wanted. He could go to those physics lectures. He can contribute to them himself. If you were Ted Hall or Greenglass, you would not have been able to go to most of those colloquiums, if any of them. Somebody like Greenglass would not have had access to any of that type of information. So this system worked pretty well, but it wasn't perfect. Again, you could find ways to get around, and Greenglass in particular did, to get to information that he did not have a need to know for. But overall, I mean, I think it was a pretty good security system, and it was improved over time. But he took advantage, some of them took advantage of the gaps.
Great. We have a virtual audience question right here.
Was an aggressive disinformation strategy planned bodyguard for D-Day ever considered for the Manhattan Project, and could such a thing have ever been practical?
Okay, so hopefully I think I've got the gist of the question here. D-Day, I mean, and we've got folks in the room. Rich probably knows a lot about this. I mean, there were essentially, what were they called, ghost armies that were created to try and throw the Nazis off, to try and make them think that the Allies were going to land at Calais instead of at Normandy. A lot of effort went into that. The Soviets were actually very good at that type of warfare as well. In terms of the Manhattan Project, I'm not aware of anything like that, at least on that scale. Now, I do think that there were kind of lower level disinformation campaigns that were started, spreading false information at the La Fonda bar by security people and things like that. There were a lot of rumors about what was going on in Los Alamos at the time, and those rumors were allowed to run rampant. I think the wildest one, so again, we've got Los Alamos history experts here too. I think the wildest one, for instance, was that it was a submarine base. I mean, you've heard the submarine base. No. There was a tunnel. There was a tunnel, right? The pipes from Oak Ridge, and that's the thing. I mean, in World War II, there were all kinds of stories, all kinds of wild stories, and so you had things like that. There was, there's other stories as well that probably I'm not going to mention now, but I think that those rumors were actually beneficial. The secrecy was maintained, I think, remarkably well. Again, given, and that number, 500,000 plus, Alex Wellerstein was mentioned earlier. He has an article on that on his blog that goes into a great amount of depth about the number of people working on the Manhattan Project. But compartmentalization worked. I mean, keep in mind that beyond the espionage at Los Alamos, there really wasn't very much beyond that. There was some. But the Los Alamos espionage, I think, was the most useful because it got to the heart of the project where all of this effort came together. I don't want to diminish anything that went anywhere else because, you don't have material from Oak Ridge. You don't have a weapon. You don't have plutonium from Hanford. You don't have a weapon. But so much of it, what do you do with the material, all came back to Los Alamos. But yeah, I'm not aware of anything, on that D-Day type scale, but I think they did a pretty good job. Again, there were some problems with it, but all things considered, the speed, the scale, the level of secrecy that they were able to maintain, I think is pretty impressive.
All right, we have time for one more question right here.
So, Alan, you are, and as am I, convinced that Ethel Rosenberg was guilty, but just last week an article came out from her sons who have tried for years and years to get her exonerated, saying that there are now new Soviet documents coming out saying she wasn't involved. So can you talk a little bit about what she actually did?
I've not seen the article. Now, I'm skeptical of everything, Because that's what historians have to be, just like scientists, right? And so I'm wondering if there's like a list in the Soviet archives that says, okay, Ethel Rosenberg didn't do anything. That strikes me as odd to begin with. So maybe she's just not mentioned or something like that. I'd have to see the source material. But yeah, I mentioned earlier recruiting. She played a part in recruiting. If you recruit somebody to commit espionage, you in effect are guilty of espionage, according to the law, is my understanding. She also, before we had email, we had Ethel. Maybe that's where the E comes from. She did a lot to help to convey this information to the Soviet Union, to transmit it. She was well aware of it, just as Julius, of course, was. It's not like Julius was doing all this work, there in the apartment, and she didn't know what was going on. She did, and she made contributions to it. And again, if you look at that, that's clear. For the contributions that she made, for helping to share information, for helping recruit her brother, should a human being be sent to the electric chair for that? Most people that I ask when we have these conversations, they're like, no. And a lot of times, I don't think any of us are really fond of capital punishment to begin with. But in that case, Klaus Fuchs, who did a lot of work, he went to prison for 9 years. David Greenglass went to prison for 9 years. Ethel Rosenberg, I'd like to see that evidence because I keep an open mind. Maybe there is something. Oh, yeah, totally. I will mention this, though. When I mentioned problematic records earlier, you can't take a Soviet record at face value. They're really loaded. And again, with the Perseus myth that was created later, it's kind of in its own category. But even these codes that were cracked during World War II, there's so much history back behind them. And that's why, fortunately, we do have specialists like John and Harvey and other people who I rely on when I tell this story. Because you have to remember, when I can't answer a question, my day job is I'm the historian at a laboratory that has been around for 80 years and done all kinds of work in all kinds of areas, and I have to know everything about it, which I don't, just a little bit. And so that's why I try to point people to, people like John and Harvey have spent a career on this and done really remarkable work, and I want to make sure that they and others get credit for it. But yeah, no, I didn't see that. I will mention in closing, I would definitely recommend that, as I'm going to do, look up that story and look up other stories about the Rosenberg children. It's heartbreaking. It really is. And it's an important perspective. I think that they were about 5 and 9 years old, something like that. Can you imagine you're a little kid and your parents get arrested by the FBI and then nobody wants you? Ultimately, I believe a husband and wife, members of the Communist Party, brought them into their home and took care of them. And actually, the husband, I believe, wrote a famous song, Strange Fruit. Has anybody heard that? Look that song up, too, for another interesting perspective on American history as well. But anyway, it really is a heartbreaking story. And I think that they eventually came to realize that, yeah, their dad was guilty and had lied to them. Apparently, they've not come around to the same opinion of their mother. But I'm very sympathetic to that perspective. My heart goes out. But the history's the history.
All right. Thank you, Alan. Everybody give him a round of applause.